All right. Hello, everyone. In this recording, I'm going to present the 2018 article titled Endogenous Disasters, published at AER. And it's a joint paper with Petrosky-Nadeau and Kuehn. So in this article, we demonstrate that the textbook Diamond-Mortensen-Pisaridis model of equilibrium unemployment gives rise endogenously to economic disasters. So I'm going to dive directly into the model. And because the motivation of the work is self-evident, because after the 2007, 2009 Great Recession, so it's pretty self-evident that we need to take big business cycle dynamics seriously. This is one effort in that direction. And in addition, in the surprising literature, so the disasters, the Reed-Sparrow disasters framework has been popular as well. So we are trying to have some linkage between the surprising literature and the macroeconomic dynamics. So the model is really the baseline model is really simple. It's a textbook model of the equilibrium unemployment model. So the model is populated by a representative household and the representative firm. The firm posts job vacancies to attract unemployed workers through a constant return to scale matching function, and we are using the Zhang, Remy, Watson 2000 specification of the matching function instead of the more popular Cobb-Douglas function. The Zhang et al. Matching function specification is fairly convenient because it's implied the job filling rate and the job finding rate are both naturally between 0 and 1. So for example, the job filling rate is the fraction of new hires divided by number of total vacancies, and that's in which theta is labor market tightness, vacancy divided by number of unemployed workers. So that's labor market tightness, and the job filling rate given by this Q of theta t, and Q is naturally between 0 and 1 without any friction, without any restrictions. So if we were using Cobb-Douglas matching function, for example, we have to manually ensure that the job finding rate and job filling rates are between 0 and 1. And that's going to be computationally awkward. So the unit cost of vacancy when the representative firm posts vacancies to hire workers, the firm has to incur costs. So we're following Pisaridis' 2009 article at Econometrica to capture both proportional costs given by kappa 0 and fixed costs given by kappa 1. The fixed matching costs are paid after a hired worker arrives. This includes the training, interviewing, negotiation, as well as administrative setup costs. So once matched, jobs are destroyed at a constant separation rate. So this is exogenous separation. So next period employment equals current period employment net of separation and the plus number of new hires. The number of new hires is given by the vacancy filling rate times the total number of vacancies being posted. And the number of vacancy has to be non-negative, okay, in our simulations. So this vacancy constraint can actually be binding, although with very small probability. So for numerical accuracy, we choose to impose this restriction. The firm uses labor as the single productive input to produce output through a constant return to scale production function that's given by this functional form, in which the log labor productivity follows a standard AR1 process. So dividends to shareholders equal output minus wage expenses minus total vacancy costs. So we're assuming the representative household has the simple log utility. So the firm's going to take household stochastic discount factor as given and solves the value maximization problem, and in which the market value of equity is going to equal to the present value of future stream of dividends. And firm, of course, faces the employment accumulation equation as well as the vacancy non-activity constraint. So the model is simple in the sense that there's only one functional equation to solve, which is the intertemporal job creation condition. The left-hand side is the marginal costs of hiring with the vacancy non-activity constraint accounted for. Okay. The right-hand side is marginal benefit of hiring. Basically, after you pay the marginal cost of hiring, at the beginning of next period, you're going to have one extra unit of employment, and the employment that work is going to produce for you to provide marginal product of labor, and you have to pay the worker with the wage rate. And then at the end of T+1, next period, the net of separation, and you're going to have extra unit of employment, and that's going to be worth a marginal cost of hiring next period for you. So that's the continuation value. And because of the non-activity constraint, you have to respect the Kuehn-Tucker conditions. So this is the intertemporal job creation condition, because in the model, Holzio condition, 1990 condition doesn't hold. Competitive equilibrium is not Pareto optimal. The reason is that when the firm posts vacancies, the firm's going to take the externality, not as the firm's going to take a vacancy filling rate as given. Okay, in other words, the firm is not going to internalize the search and matching externality into account, but presumably a benevolent social planner will. Okay, and because of this externality, the search and matching frictions in the model, the Pareto, the competitive equilibrium from the model is not Pareto optimal, so we have to work directly with the first order condition through a projection method. Of course, you can work with value function. Even with one firm, you can impose a Croissant-Smith type of outer loop with only one firm. You can close the model. You can close the computational algorithm, equilibrium algorithm that way. But we have ended up with the projection algorithm with the first order condition from the beginning. So we feel comfortable with this algorithm. So wages are derived from the standard Nash bargaining game, standard Nash wage. So wage, it depends on marginal product of labor, not surprisingly. If a worker is more productive, I'm going to earn more, the worker is going to earn more. If the worker is more popular on the labor market, right? In other words, it's going to be if for your home institution, it is more costly for the home institution to replace you, and then your wage is going to be higher as well. And finally, if you can simply sit at home, enjoying leisure, unemployment, government employment payout, insurance for benefits, for example, if my flow value of unemployment activity is high, then the company has to pay me more. Okay, so in particular, this eta parameter, this is the bargaining weight of the workers in the Nash bargaining process. If eta is small, okay, it turns out the wage elasticity to labor productivity is going to be small as well. In other words, wages are going to be relatively insulated from marginal product of labor, so therefore giving rise to wage inertia. So I know in the macro labor literature, there are more elaborate models for inertial wages, but the fact is that even in the commonly called the flexible Nash setting, wages are actually inertial as well, especially relative to the frictionless labor market wages, in which wages are simply proportional to the output on the Cobb-Douglas production function. All right, so the goods market clears, so which is output equals consumption plus total vacancy costs. Then there's no capital, there's no investment, so that doesn't show up in the equilibrium condition. So competitive equilibrium, recursive competitive equilibrium is fairly standard. So you have vacancies, vacancy policy, vacancy and Lagrange multiplier on the vacancy constraints have to satisfy the intertemporal job creation condition, Kuehn-Tucker condition, while taking the wage equation as given, as well as the vacancy filling rate as given, because firm doesn't affect that directly. Well, it does, but doesn't take that into account. Therefore, therefore there's no social welfare function for you to do value function iteration on. Consumption and consumption, actually this is a typo. There's no recursive utility. There's no J function here. So basically that's just basically consumption satisfies the optimality condition for the consumption oil equation. Okay. So and finally, goods market and financial market clear. So we solved the model using globally nonlinear projection, a method with parameterized expectations, following the idea of Cristiano and Fisher 2000 JEDC paper. So okay, so basically we need to solve the vacancy function from this while obeying the Kuehn-Tucker condition. So we're gonna use Rowan-Horst procedure. So in a prior recording, I presented the Petrosky-Nadeau and Zhang 2017 article published in Quantitative Economics. We go into greater details about the computation algorithm, but in this presentation, I'm just going to be briefly describe. We used Rowan-Horst procedure with 17 grid points to discretize the labor productivity. Process 17 means we are looking at the -4, +4 unconditional standard deviations surround the mean, so it's a pretty large grid. And on the n dimension, we're going to use cubic splines with 50 basis functions. I think in the programs we may have used 75 basis functions. So finite element methods. So 75 nodes. So each small areas we're imposing, we're putting on a cubic spline. So to make sure the results are fairly accurate. So we parameterize the expectations because the vacancy can be constrained at 0. So at the constrained point, then the policy function is going to be kinked. Okay, so that's going to be, and of course the Lagrange multiplier will be kinked by definition. So if you impose some smooth functions on that, so it can be challenging to approximate. So we end up building on Cristiano and Fisher and impose and then parameterize directly the conditional expectation, which is the right-hand side in the temporal job creation condition, and that's a smooth function. So so after we calculated conditional expectation, we calculate what happens to Q tilde backed out as this fraction. In particular, if Q tilde is higher than 1, we know the constraint is binding, and then it's straightforward to write down vacancy being 0. That means job market, labor market tightness is 0, Q equals 1, and the Lagrange multiplier on the vacancy constraint is simply the sum of 2 kappas minus the conditional expectation. So, and in this way, we satisfy the intertemporal job creation condition. So on the other hand, if Q tilde is less than 1, so that means the vacancy filling rate is a real probability. That means the constraint is not binding. We set the lambda to be 0, and we solve the labor market tightness using the inverse function from the job filling rate, and we get the job. We solve for the vacancy labor market tightness, and therefore vacancy equals the tightness times unemployment rate. Okay, we know unemployment, and N is a state variable. Unemployment is basically 1 minus employment because the total population is normalized to be 1. All right, so monthly calibration, our calibration follows the spirit of Hagedorn-Minovsky. In particular, we are using a relatively low workers' bargaining rate and a relatively high flow value of unemployment activities, 0.85. So Hagedorn-Minovsky end up using 0.955, and we show in our quantitative economics article that once you solve the model more accurately using projection algorithm, it turns out that you do not need the flow value, B value being 0.955. It turns out the unemployment volatility is already pretty high using projection algorithm. So we ended up using 0.85. So the other parameters are fairly standard, I would say. In particular, we follow Girdler and Chigari and calibrate the conditional volatility of shocks for labor productivity such that we match the output volatility in the Barrow-Ursula cross-country macro history panel. Let's look at the quantitative results. So as noted, we calibrate the volatility of labor productivity to hit the output volatility in the historical cross-country panel. So 5.3% versus 5.6% per year in the data. So the consumption volatility is a bit lower than that in the data. It's a bit peculiar feature in the data. In the historical data panel, the consumption volatility is actually a bit higher than the output volatility because of some government purchasing during the wartime period. And our focus in this paper is on macrodynamics, and therefore we are matching the model output volatility to the data output growth volatility. On the employment rate, and on average in the model we have 6.3% and close to that in the data. And the volatility for unemployment is 23% per quarter. That's per quarter, and that's close to 22% in the data as well. Let's see. The model generates fat tail feature of consumption growth as well as output growth. Although the skewness is a little bit, well, by a little bit, I mean significantly mismatched, in the sense that the output growth and consumption growth in the data are slightly negatively skewed, but in the model is slightly positively skewed, and the p-values are significant. But the higher moments for unemployment rate, including skewness and kurtosis, so we are doing a slightly better job, although the kurtosis in the model is a bit higher than that in the data, but the p-values are insignificant. So on this slide, we're reporting empirical cumulative distribution functions of unemployment, output and consumption out of 1 million month simulation from the model's stationary distribution. So you can see most of the time unemployment hovers around 6.2% mean or median, while the median is slightly different. Right, so most of the time hovers around the median, and with small probability it spikes up like crazy. So correspondingly, most of the time output stays in normal times, median times, but with small probability output can fall off a cliff, and so does consumption. And this is the severe tail risk that we are writing on, and that's hence the title of the paper, Endogenous Disasters. So in terms of quantitative moments, so the data moments are from at the empirical estimates that we use, that we implement directly on the Barrow-Ursula macro history panel. So our estimates are slightly bigger. The disaster probabilities are slightly bigger than their estimates, even though we are using their data extended to later periods, several years after their sample end. And the reason is that we adjusted for growth. So we just subtract each period consumption and output growth with the average growth rates in the panel, because in the model there's no growth. Okay, so therefore the disaster probabilities we estimated in the data a bit higher than what the Barrow and Ursula were reporting in their 2008 article. So they were reporting 3.7, high threes, slightly less than 4%, and our estimates are a bit higher. Well, somewhat higher, or quite a bit higher, depending how you see it. So, but bottom line is that our output disaster probability in the model is 5%, and this is, you know, which is somewhat lower than what we estimated in the data, 7.8%. By the way, the disaster hurdle peak to trough measurement, the details are in the paper. So it's basically Barrow-Ursula defined a cumulative decline of output or consumption of 10% hurdle, and that's the economic definition. That's the definition of for economic disaster. So, and look at the p-values, we get so none of them are significant for output disasters. So probability 5%, disaster size is on average 22%. So is disaster duration. In the model, it lasts about 4.4%. In the data, is 3.7%. So I should mention our consumption disaster probability is quite a bit lower than that in the data, and therefore is significant. You see the p-value being 0. So p-value is the fraction of model moment being higher than that in the data. So it's one-sided, the p-value. So we also looked at the distribution of disasters by size. It follows like a power distribution. So this is and duration as well. So this is mostly consistent with the Barrow and Zhang's econometric paper. So comparative statics. So in this table, so we fix all the other parameter values, but change one parameter value at a time. So here, so the first column is the baseline calibration, disaster moments in the model. So in the second column, we reduce the flow value of unemployment from 0.85 to 0.825. You see the results are quite sensitive, which means that the flow value is really important for the model dynamics. So reduce it slightly, and you see the disaster dynamic probability for output drops to 3.6, size drops from 22 to 16, although the duration is not much affected. And if you lower B value further, the flow value of unemployment further to 0.4, that's the value used in Scheimer 2005. You see that the disaster probability shrinks further and the size shrinks further. And again, duration actually increases slightly. So bottom line is that the B value is quite important. In a sense, this is perhaps not surprising because the paper is all about the nonlinearity, and you have to approach the nonlinear region is like a metaphor. I would think it would be the long-run risk model, right? So the persistence in expected consumption growth has to be close to 1 at 0.95 and higher, right? And then you get a lot of kicks. And the lower that persistence, the most of the dynamics go away. So we're not using 0.98, and we're approaching, but the bottom line is that we're kind of approaching the event horizon 0.85, right? So, and approach that, the economy is going to blow. And if you increase p value from 0.85 upward, you're going to see much more stronger nonlinear dynamics. So, all right. So the next comparative static we looked at is the separation rate. In the benchmark calibration, we use 4%. Now, in this experiment, we use 3.5%. And because the jobs are destroyed at the slower rate, as a result, the disaster probability reduces, falls somewhat. The size also falls somewhat. Again, duration is not much affected. So this kappa T, the next experiment we looked at, we removed the fixed cost of vacancy posting. Although we keep the mean largely unchanged, okay, we simply remove the fixed matching costs. So it turns out the fixed matching costs is important because it provides a downward rigidity for marginal hiring costs. Okay, so for marginal hiring costs, right. So the probability drops a little bit, and size drops a little bit, and iota is the probability that governs the coverage of the matching function. So the benchmark value is 1.25. So reducing the iota parameter, you make the frictions less efficient. You are throwing the sand into the labor market machine, search and the matching apparatus. As a result, the labor market becomes more frictional and the disaster probability goes up. Although size mostly unchanged, and duration is unchanged also. So eta, finally, the eta parameter is the workers' bargaining weight. The benchmark value is 4%. You increase the eta parameter. As a result, workers have more bargaining power, and as a result, the unemployment rate is going to go up because workers are eating a bigger share of the pie. So firms are going to hire fewer workers. Unemployment rate goes up, disaster probability goes up as well, although the size and duration basically unchanged. All right, so I should probably argue that we jumped through all kinds of hoops in persuading in the editorial process, in defending our calibration with relatively low eta value and relatively high flow value of unemployment, and especially during the Great Depression, there was not a whole lot of unemployment benefit, right? So in the US, it turns out in the UK, there was quite a bit of unemployment benefit handed out by the government, but in the US, it was not the case. So we ended up interpreting our low eta and high B calibration as a metaphor for real wage inertia, okay? So, and that's an important mechanism. So, and our intuition, which is confirmed in our subsequent work. So in the 2021 GME article, that the more elaborate model of wage inertia, we ended up using the subsequent work, we ended up using Hall and Milgram's credible bargaining scheme, credible bargaining game. The model becomes more evolved, a lot more equations to solve, but the basic disaster dynamics survive. Okay, so bottom line is that we interpret this calibration within Nash wage as a metaphor for wage inertia, and of course we're open to alternative interpretations, and which all seem reasonable from our perspective. So in other words, wage inertia is an important driving force of our disaster dynamic. Another aspect of the driving force for the disaster dynamics is what we call downward rigidity in marginal hiring costs. So I think, and this intuition is due to Nikola. So I think based on my reading of the literature, so I think it seems that our paper might be the first one in the literature that talk about this mechanism. So again, this mechanism is due to Nikola. All right, so what's downward rigidity in marginal hiring costs? In the left panel, we are presenting the vacancy filling rate for 3 different levels of labor productivity. So the blue line is a low value, a very low level. So we have 17 grid point. I think this is X3 from low to high. So this is a very low level of labor productivity. The black broken dot line, it's a X15. So in other words, it's a relatively high level of labor productivity, and that's basically that's an economic boom. Whereas the red broken line is the median level. It's the median economy. So 50th percentile is the median. So the right panel is the marginal hiring costs. It's given by this form. Let's ignore the Lagrange multiplier on the vacancy constraint for a sec. So bottom line is that you see that the intuition is the search and matching externality. So in good times, firms are competing among themselves, right, for a given pool of workers, and for a given vacancy, the probability of that vacancy being filled is small because you are competing among your competitors, among the firms are competing among yourselves, right? So for a given vacancy being filled, the probability of that is small. Whereas in recessions, in a really bad time, right? So there are a lot of unemployed workers. They are chasing the limited number of vacancies, not a whole lot of vacancies to begin with. So it is the competition, the abundance is in the unemployed workers. They are competing among themselves to compete for your vacancy. So as long as you can hire, you post a vacancy, that vacancy will be filled right away. In other words, Q is going to be 1. Okay, in a bad time. In a good time, Q is gonna decline, and not all the way to 0, but it gets quite a bit smaller. So correspondingly, if you look at the marginal hiring costs, you see that in bad times, you are facing a floor. So kappa 0 plus kappa 1. So in our, they're both 0.5 in our calibration. The downward floor is 1. So in other words, marginal cost of hiring, even if you do nothing, regardless of what you do, you always end up paying a given a minimum amount of downward floor. That's what we call downward rigidity in marginal hiring costs. And whereas in good times, right? So Q goes down in the denominator, and your marginal costs rise up. And that's why in this model, economic expansions are more gradual because of the nonlinearity, whereas disasters are fast and furious. So the fact that you face downward rigidity in marginal hiring costs, this is a distinctive feature from stochastic growth model. In that model, marginal investment costs, for example, equal 0 when firms do sit and do nothing, right? If I just wait, I don't have to pay anything. So if I just wait, I don't invest or disinvest, I pay 0 marginal investment costs. So, and this is why the search economy involves more risk than the standard RBC economy. All right, so let me pull wage inertia and the downward rigidity in marginal cost together to describe the causal mechanism of the disaster dynamics in our model. So how can a standard textbook model generate endogenous disasters, right? So imagine a relatively a large negative shock or cumulatively string of bad shocks hitting the economy, right? So, and the wages are inertial. So output falls, but the wages don't fall as well, but not by much. So you have somewhat of operating leverage effect endogenously. As a result, the profit's going to fall more. Okay. So at the same time, firms are going to face downward rigidity in marginal hiring costs. Marginal hiring costs remain relatively high. At the same time, profits are falling. So firms are sandwiched in a tough spot. At one point, firms are going to say, look, hiring freeze. So the hiring incentives are stifled. As a result, when the aggregate employment tumbles down cumulatively by 10%, and that's Sparrow and Ursula's definition of economic disasters. Okay, and that's the disaster dynamics within the search model. And so far in the macro labor literature, the focus has been mostly on unemployment volatility puzzle. So we try to bring out the higher order implications, disaster dynamics, to say something in the paper about Great Depression, and later on we talked about unemployment crisis again in the Great Depression, and later on we also talked about how to build an equilibrium as a pricing model on top of this engine. So now the rest of the paper, we explored the multiple extensions, more realistic extensions than the textbook model. So the basic result is that, look, the disaster dynamics is not a reliable feature, robust feature of the search economy. Okay, it's not just very special to the baseline model. The fact that the second you put the globally nonlinear algorithm on this economy, the economy has a lot of interesting, intriguing dynamics. Dare I say, realistic dynamics that so far being ignored in the literature. All right, the first extension we actually in the online appendix, we implemented the extension of leisure, with the leisure using Greenwood, Herkowitz, and Hoffman 1988 preferences. It turns out that the economy is virtually isomorphic to the baseline model. So, and that's why because it's so simple, we put that in the internet appendix. So in the paper, we included the home production extension, capital, as well as recursive utility. So, all right. So home production. So in the home production, we again follow the existing literature on home production. The detailed references are in the paper. So in the presence of home production or home consumption, there are two types of consumption goods: market goods, and homemade goods. Okay, and composite consumption is CES functional form of market goods and home goods. Okay. So, and this E controls for the elasticity of substitution between these two types of goods. And A is the shifting parameter determining how much you really like or dislike home goods. Dislike, actually. So A is in front of the first term. The stochastic discount factor is a bit more complicated, even with log utility. So now you have two types of goods, with home goods buried in the composite bundle, and the market good shows up in the first term. Home production, we are using the so AK kind of model. So home production is basically productivity times unemployment. That's how much, if you are sitting at home, you are engaging in home production. So because there's no direct evidence on productivity shocks on home production, so we just assume home production productivity is a constant. So the equilibrium Nash wage is quite similar to the baseline model. Instead of a constant, the flow value of unemployment, now the flow value depends on home production, depends on home goods and markets goods in equilibrium, okay, in addition to government payout and leisure and whatnot, okay? So So you can see some intuition directly flowing out of this ZT equation already. First of all, wow, in the model, the ratio of market consumption divided by home consumption is large. So it's 15 or so. So basically, household consumes a small percentage of home goods, and the most of the consumption is still market goods. All right. So some home goods have some appeal, diversify my tastes, right? So if my tastes are a bit diversified, home goods are valuable, or even though they are not the major component in my consumption bundle. In other words, so when elasticity becomes higher, that if market goods and home goods become more substitutable, and then home goods will lose some appeal, right? So mechanically, when E goes up, Z is going to go down, right? So that means if home goods and market goods are more substitutable, and then home production loses some appeal, right? In that case, my flow value of unemployment activities is going to go down, right? So that has the same impact of earlier comparative statics in the baseline model, in which I lowered the B value, or that's going to dampen the disaster dynamics. So analogously, if A goes up, if the household likes market goods more, that means my flow value of unemployment is going to go down. Again, if I like market goods more, and that means I dislike more home goods, or home production is going to be less valuable for me. So I really need to get back to work. And that again dampens the disaster dynamics in the market sector. So finally, market clearing condition is just market goods, market consumption plus total vacancy costs going to add up to market production, or production output of the market goods. All right, quantitative results. So we rescale the volatility for labor productivity on the market sector, such that we match the output volatility in the data. The bottom line is that the disaster dynamics persist that we first saw in the baseline model. They show up in the home production model. If anything, the disaster probability is actually higher than that in the data, so 9.95%. Disaster size slightly smaller, and duration is quite close to that in the data. So the table also reports two comparative statics. In the first comparative statics, so we increase the A parameter. That means the household likes market goods more. As noted earlier, if the market likes market goods more, that means the ZT is going to drop. That means the flow value of unemployment activities is going to drop, and that's going to dampen the disaster dynamics. So that's what we see here. Disaster probability falls from 9.95% to 6.9%, and disaster size drops as well. Okay, so in the second comparative static, we increase elasticity from 0.85 to 0.9. So intuitively, if market goods and home goods are more substitutable, then home production loses its appeal. The flow value drops again. As a result, disaster probability falls from 9.95% to 8.2%, and size drops, disaster size drops as well. So bottom line is that, so the mechanisms the causal mechanisms make a lot of sense with home production, and most important, disaster dynamics are robust vis-a-vis this extension on home production. In the second extension, we incorporate capital, as capital is fairly standard in business cycle modeling, and we use Cope-Douglas, and X, instead of labor productivity, it is now total factor productivity, and we're going to rescale X bar such that marginal product of labor is around 1 in simulations in the stochastic steady state, This way, we return the nice economic interpretation for labor market parameters. For example, 0.85 for B literally means 0.85. So imagine if the labor productivity is actually on average B in 2, right? Then 0.85 only means 0.425. So it will be halved. So this way, by rescale the X bar parameter such that marginal product labor is always around the 1 on average, we get to have easier time interpreting the model parameters. So capital accumulation, we have capital. We have follow Yearman 1998, the GME paper in using this installation function. So it's fairly convenient because this function implies that the marginal benefit of investment when investment goes to 0, it's positive infinite. It's positive infinity, and as a result, if you use this installation function, so aggregate investment in the model is never negative. It's never 0 or negative. And this is as in the data, so you don't have to impose any irreversibility constraint manually. So this makes the model simpler and perhaps more elegant. So intertemporal investment Euler equation, fairly standard. Intertemporal job creation conditions, same as before. We have equilibrium wage, same as before as well, but the only difference is that instead of exogenous labor productivity xt, now the labor productivity is proportional to output share, right? So it's proportional to output. It depends on basically the marginal product of labor is going to depend on capital. And finally, goods market clear. So let's look at the quantitative results again to make sure the model is comparable to the baseline model. We again rescaled the productivity shock. In this case, the conditional volatility of total factor productivity to match the output volatility in the data. Okay, 5.1 versus 5.6, we get close. So importantly, you see that output disaster probability is 9.45%. It's slightly higher than that in the data, but slightly lower in the home production case. The disaster size drops slightly, but not by much, still 19%. Duration rate is slightly higher. In the remaining 2 columns, so we reported 2 comparative statics, actually 1, just 2 different parameter values. So this new parameter in the installation function is the supply elasticity of capital. So a lower value of new means there are more adjustment costs in adjusting your capital stock. There are more frictions in adjusting your capital stock. All right. So as you lower the new value, there are more adjustment costs. Okay. So as a result, not surprisingly, you can see investment volatility drops from virtually 7% to only 2.9%. Correspondingly, you see that consumption volatility increases because household is more restricted by adjustment costs to smooth consumption. As a result, the household consumption volatility becomes higher, 3.7% to 4.8%. Accordingly, investment volatility goes down drastically. Okay, even though, as you can see, output volatility is relatively unaffected, right? Only 5.1% drops slightly to 4.9%. So the adjustment cost basically redistribute volatility from investment growth to consumption growth, while leaving output growth largely unaffected. And that's the impact of adjustment cost parameter. All right, finally, so we had our I eyes on asset pricing from the first draft of this article, but we couldn't close the deal. We couldn't combine recursive utility and the capital together and solve that model simultaneously. We actually solved the simpler version of the model, but the equity premium is so down low because at the time we were using Cobb Douglas, so we had to compromise. After 2 years and 8 months of first major revision at AER, the second revision took another year, so that's why it took so long for this paper to hit the target. We are very grateful we received a tremendous amount of help from the editorial team, for which we are very grateful. So, but bottom line is that recursive utility right here, we reported some asset pricing results, but the results are limited because of low investment, and the capital is important, as shown by Urban Yerman's paper, Rowenhoff's paper early on, that capital investment consumption smoothing is actually represents the core challenge of understanding asset pricing in DSG production economy, and that we had to tackle that challenge in a later paper. So, but for now, recursive utility, fairly standard from Epson Zhang and the Whale as well. So consumption Euler equation. So that's the pricing kernel, and that's the stock return. In this case, it's just a hiring return because there's no capital. Stock return is basically marginal benefit of hiring next period divided by marginal benefit of hiring today. Okay. So again, let me focus on the disaster moments. So again, look at this is our benchmark calibration in this model. Again, we match the output volatility 5.67%, and then look at disaster probability. So 4.5%. So it's roughly comparable, maybe slightly higher than that in the baseline model, roughly the same range in the baseline model. And disaster size is slightly bigger, duration is slightly bigger as well. And in this case, we have equity premium 4.45%. So volatility 16%, 15.8%, which is not bad. But again, this is without the capital, and that extension has to wait another 4 years to come along. All right, so let me conclude. In the 2018 the Endogenous Disasters paper, we show that the textbook Diamond, Mortensen, Pisaridis model of equilibrium unemployment gives rise endogenously to economic disasters, and we feel this result is quite important, as broad implications. Imagine the basic search engine can be embedded, has been embedded in many medium scale DSG models, but most of the time the disaster dynamics have been ignored. And I think carefully quantifying the big dynamics and evaluate the policy implications in a more realistic DSG monetary new cancer models would be on top of the priority list in our research program for sure. And I encourage others to take a look at this important issue also. Thank you.